The following is a message from Christ Central Manchester, a church that meets in the heart of Manchester in the UK. To find out more about us, please visit www.christcentral.org.uk.
Good morning. Can you hear me? It sounds like I'm on. That's better. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Matt. I'm one of the leaders here at Christ Central. We're going to be continuing our series this morning looking at the parables of Jesus. So the parable we're looking at this morning is going to be the parable of the 10 virgins. But before we get started, I'm just interested, do a quick survey. How many people here this morning are got a reasonable sort of expectation that the world will end tonight? If that's you, just pop your hand in the air. Anybody? Nobody thinks the world's going to end tonight. How about if we did it for a slightly longer time frame? How many people are thinking, planning your life around, sort of making arrangements in case the world ends in the next 7 days? Less than a week. Nobody? Still nobody? Yeah, I've not got my hand up either. I'm not really expecting that to happen. And yet, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. There's lots of stuff, if we all went around every day thinking, oh, the world might end tonight, we'd never get started on stuff, let alone finished on some really important stuff. But Jesus is quite clear that at some point it will happen. We don't know when, but he wants us to be ready. And I guess if I thought the world was going to end in the next week, my plans for this week might look a bit different to what they currently do, which basically involves watching as much Olympics as I possibly can, and trying to pretend I'm working at my desk whilst checking the BBC News feed for who's won medals recently. But if I thought the world was going to end in the next few days, I would spend my time doing what? That's the question. What would be the right thing to be devoting my energy to, focusing my time on? Because we're called to be prepared, but kind of not obsessed. We're called to be ready, but not just sort of idly waiting. Expecting, but not distracted by it. And the parable of the 10 virgins really kind of forces us to look at some of these issues. It sits in the middle of a lengthy conversation between Jesus and his disciples, kind of all about the end of the world. It's prompted by the disciples asking him a question. At the start of Matthew chapter 24, the disciples ask Jesus, they basically want a tip-off. They want to know, how can we spot the end of the world before it happens? How can we get ready? How can we get a head start? And they say to him, Matthew 24 verse 3, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus gives them a pretty full answer. It includes the parable of the 10 virgins that we're going to look at in detail this morning, but I think it's worth just taking a minute or two to understand the full scope of the conversation that this parable sits in. Jesus starts off by outlining quite explicitly some of the warning signs. He's very straightforward about it. He talks about war and earthquake and false prophets and false alarms. But he's also very clear that these are just the early warning signs. These are just the beginning. This is sort of the start, but not the end. When it happens, you'll know about it. It'll be sudden, it'll be dramatic, it will be unmissable, but nobody knows when that will be apart from God the Father. Jesus is emphatic about that. He repeats the point. There's no point trying to work it out, getting your Bible out and doing funny maths out of Book of Revelation or Book of Daniel, whatever it is. No point trying to work it out from the stars. You won't get it right. It's a waste of time. Jesus is really quite explicit about that, but he's equally explicit about the fact that it will happen. And he wants us to be prepared. Because he's given the disciples probably the answer they were looking for, but he carries on teaching because he's got more that he wants to tell them. He wants them to understand that they need to be prepared. He wants us to understand that we need to be prepared. And so he follows up this initial kind of outlining of the signs of the end of the age with 3 parables back to back, and then some more teaching about the day of judgment, where he uses the picture of a shepherd sorting sheep from goats to kind of make his point about the day of judgment. The first parable he tells is a very simple comparison of two servants, one servant who's faithful and one who's wicked. Both are left in charge of the master's house, and we see their actions and the contrast in terms of their end outcome. The second parable that we'll be looking at in detail this morning is the parable of the 10 virgins, sometimes known as the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins. The third parable is a very well known one. It's the parable of the talents, where the focus very much is around the expectation that believers will put the good news about Jesus into, and the gifts that God's given them in their lives, into good purpose, into good effect in their life. He then follows that up with this teaching about the day of judgment, where he gives a picture of the shepherd sorting the sheep from the goats, and he describes how the people who are judged to have done well will be those who have shown kindness and compassion and put love into action in the world around them. And there's a thread, there's a theme that Jesus builds through this whole section, through Matthew chapter 24 and chapter 25, about, yes, the end of the world is coming, there will be consequences at that point in time, and he wants us to be prepared. And I think it's interesting because the parable of the 10 virgins that we're looking at this morning kind of bridges the gap in this teaching a little bit. The first part of the teaching is very much about the fact that you don't know when it's coming, but it will come. The second half of the teaching is very much around what being prepared looks like. The parable of the 10 virgins kind of sits in the middle, and it talks a bit about the need to be prepared, that you don't know when it's going to happen, so you need to be prepared. It also kind of starts queuing up some ideas about what being prepared looks like, which is then followed up with the other teaching. So let's read the passage. It's Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 to 13. The words will come up behind me, so don't worry if you've not got a Bible with you. So this is Jesus speaking in the middle of this lengthy conversation with his disciples. He says, "At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight the cry rang out, 'Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out.' 'No,' they replied, 'there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves.' But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. 'Lord, Lord,' they said, 'open the door for us.' But he replied, 'Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour.'" I'll be honest with you, this parable is not one I've always felt like I got very much out of. It's kind of, I was familiar with it, but I never really felt like I got to grips with it and felt the benefit of it. And so I've kind of tended to skim over it. And I've realised, as I've some of the reasons for that, as I've been doing some studies to get ready for this morning, a lot of it's to do with where my focus was on this part of on this passage, and also what the mental image that I constructed to go with it. You know how you create a mental image, a mental picture of what people look like and what the situation looks like when you read something? I realised that my mental image for this was completely unhelpful and completely wrong. I, for some reason, had the picture of these 10 young women, and it's worth noting, virgins just is basically synonymous with young women, so unmarried young women, so probably talking teenage girls. But my focus for this picture, I kind of pictured them waiting by the side of some road in the middle of the countryside, miles from anywhere, middle of nowhere. Don't know why. There's nothing to say that that is what's happening at all. In fact, the context would be far more appropriately, and Jesus' listeners would have understood, it would have been in a town or a village, and the wedding procession would be kind of going in and out the alleyways and lanes of this town or village, kind of gathering party-goers and the people who were going to the banquet as it went along, a sort of street celebration followed by the main banquet. These young women would have been waiting on a street, probably walking distance from home, in a neighbourhood they knew, where people knew them, and they knew other people. You probably all have got that figured out, but I had missed it completely. But that then prompted me to think, well, what else have I not understood about this parable? What else is blocking me from really getting anything out of it? And so as I've done some study, I've got to say the book Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes by Kenneth Bailey, brilliant book if you're wanting to understand context of the Gospels and some of the cultural stuff. I've been doing some studying in that and some other stuff. I've ended up coming up with 4 tips, my 4 top tips for getting the most out of and understanding this parable of the 10 virgins. So, my first tip, my first pointer, was that the unmarried young women in this day and age, in that culture, had to carry a lamp at night. It was to go out without a lamp at night might be dangerous. You couldn't see who was coming towards you, who was maybe lurking in an alleyway. But more important than that, it was about demonstrating that you were above board. Going out without a lamp at night suggested that you were being secretive, that you were sneaking about, that you were up to no good, i.e. you were basically sleeping around. That was the implication of being seen out at night without a lamp. Your moral conduct was extremely questionable at best if you went out without a lamp. That's why they each need a lamp. It's not really about seeing where you're going. That's why they don't just say, oh, well, we've got 5 lamps, that's enough between 10 of us, we can see where we're going. Each young lady needs her own lamp. It's just the social norm of the day, the cultural expectation. That's why they don't just share. My second point, second tip, I strongly believe, from having read it and sort of looked at it, the women in this parable represent the church. That's why there's 10 of them. Don't know if you've ever noticed, but when Jesus tells his parables, he doesn't include spare characters. Whether there's 1, 2, 3 people, whatever, there's always a point to their presence in the story. Sometimes you have to dig and think about it a little bit, but there's always a reason. And then you look at this parable and you think, well, there's 10 of them. Why are there 10 of them? Because you could make the same point, surely, with 2 young women, 1 wise and 1 foolish, because he doesn't really distinguish between the 10 beyond those 2 groups of 5. The reason for there being 10 of them, I'm convinced, is because they represent the church. They represent the wider body of believers. My third point. Have any of you ever had this experience of driving somewhere and either running out of petrol or nearly running out of petrol? There's a few nodding heads, rueful smiles. I've got to tell you, I'm pretty risk averse. If the petrol tank gets below about 50%, I'm thinking I need to fill up. I don't like... if it gets as far as the light coming on, I'm basically in cold sweat. Esther, maybe not so much. Esther will cheerfully leave it parked up with the light on. Esther's my wife, by the way. But a couple of years ago, we were on holiday in America, and we've been doing sort of travelling about a bit, and we decided that we were going to make a trip. We were in Maine, and we were going to drive into Acadia National Park, which is right on the coast. There's a group of islands on the coast. Drive to the top of Cadillac Mountain in order to watch the sunrise. It's kind of one of the things you do if you're in that part of the world doing the tourist thing. So we get up early and we're driving in. It's about a 30-mile drive, and we're driving along this main road, and we realise probably should have filled up with petrol last night. There's a couple of bars left on the gauge, but it's not a lot. But we pass a couple of gas stations, but we don't want to miss the sunrise, so we keep pressing ahead and say, well, we'll be fine. It's another 15, 20 miles to go, and be able to come back and fill up. It won't be a problem. Then we get into the national park, and we go down to 1 bar. So my anxiety's, starting to push up a little bit at this point. But still thinking it'll be all right. It's not that long since we saw a gas station. And then we're halfway up the mountain, and we go down to 0 bars. We are officially at this point running on empty. Thankfully, we do make it up the mountain. That was my first concern, of pictures of us being stranded up halfway up the mountain in pre-dawn. We make it up the mountain and we see the sunrise. It's beautiful and wonderful. We've got a million photos. And then we get back in the car and you're hoping that when you turn the engine back on, somehow it miraculously will have reset the gauge and we'll be back up to 2 bars, or at least 1 bar. But we're not. It's still on 0 bars. And now I'm really starting to worry because it's about 15 miles since we last saw a gas station on the route we came in. We're in the national park. It's mostly, rural countryside type area. There's a small town, though, at the bottom of the mountain called Bar Harbour. But we've been there the last couple of days, and I cannot remember seeing a gas station there. And it's a small town, and we're driving down this mountain. I'm thinking I can roll down the mountain if I need to. But if there's not a gas station when we get to Bar Harbour, we're in real trouble because... And I'm thinking, I can't remember seeing one. Maybe they're not allowed them in the national park. It's an area with outstanding beauty. And all these thoughts going through me, getting more and more stressed and worried. We kind of make it down the mountainside into Bar Harbour. And I'm that worried. We pull up in Bar Harbour and I say, right, I'm not wasting any more petrol driving around looking for a gas station. I'm going to park up, I'm going to go on foot and either find one or ask somebody for directions. That's how worried I am at this point, how little petrol we've got left. Probably had 50 miles in the tank, in the engine, but I'm that worried. So I get out, park up. It's about 7:30 in the morning. There's not very many people about, but I spot a woman who's opening her shop or something, running over in a sort of stress. Where's the gas station? Where's the nearest gas station? She looks at me, not unjustifiably, like I'm a bit off my head. So take a breath. Where's the nearest gas station? Is there a gas station around here? It's just around the corner. It's on the next street. Of course it's just around the corner. This is small town America. There's a gas station around every corner. America loves its cars. There are petrol stations everywhere. We didn't need to be worried. It would have helped my blood pressure if we'd filled up the night before, but we didn't actually ever need to have worried. In Jesus' day, in the Middle East, the olive oil that they use in their lamps is just as readily available as petrol is in modern-day America. This story is not a story of the 5 rich young women who could afford and get access to this special olive oil that not many people could get hold of, and the 5 poor, poverty-stricken ones who had to make do and hope for the best. It was abundantly available. It was readily available. In fact, the 5 who forget to prepare in advance, the foolish young women, they managed to get hold of olive oil in the middle of the night. It says it's midnight when the bridegroom arrives. They still managed to get hold of olive oil. It just takes them a little while. They've probably lost some friends banging on doors in the middle of the night, but they can still get hold of olive oil. This is not about how easy it is to get hold of olive oil. It's incredibly easy. The problem is they didn't think about it and make any efforts in advance. Olive oil, the availability, the ease of which it is to get hold of it, is not the problem. My fourth point, my fourth top tip for this parable. The central point is the central point. I'll say that again. The central point is the central point. You might be wondering what I mean by that. Well, simply, it's a matter of understanding where the emphasis lies in this story. Because, I said before, one of the reasons I struggled with it was actually because my focus had tended to be really on the wrong aspect of this parable. My focus was drawn towards the bit at the end where the 5 young women are locked out. And it's probably not surprising that's where my focus was drawn, because in our culture, in our literature, in our teaching, we usually expect the main point to be at the end. The romantic climax, or the plot twist, or the moral lesson. We normally expect it to be pretty much at the end of the story. That's just culturally what we expect. And yet, it's not true in every culture and in every time. And in Jesus' day, it's known, it's accepted that actually, particularly for teaching like this, short stories or making kind of rhetorical points, the structure would be that the point in the middle was the main point. The central point was literally the central point. So the whole thing would be structured around, the first part would all be pointing towards this pointed bit in the middle, and then the second half would often reflect or have a symmetry with the first half, still pointing back to this middle point. It's all built around and focused on the middle point of the story. Even if you knew that, even if you'd heard that before, you'd read about it before, I think you can still miss it in this parable, because when you read it through on the page, it doesn't jump off the page at you, and our cultural filters are for it to be the main point at the end. So I think it's worth just taking a minute or two just to look back through the parable and see it in a different structure. So there's 7 little sections to this. It's going to come up on the screen as I talk through it, and I've kind of done some coloured highlighting things to try and draw out the pattern to it. So, the first part of the story, the bridegroom's expected and the 10 young women go out to meet him. The second part, we learn that 5 of the women are wise and have prepared extra oil, 5 are foolish and have not. The third part, they all fall asleep. And this is all building towards the middle point, the central point, the main point of the story. The bridegroom arrives. That's the middle bit, that's the big news. The bridegroom has come. That's the exciting bit of this story. That's where it's all focused about. And then we get the second half of the story, which actually reflects the first half. There's a kind of symmetry to it. So we see part 5, they all wake back up. They'd fallen asleep, and now they wake back up. 6, we see that the foolish women realise their mistake and start going out trying to make amends. And then finally, the bridegroom has arrived, and we see that he's taken in the 5 women who were prepared, have gone into the party, and the 5 who are left behind are locked out. We don't know ultimately what happens to them. It's an interesting point, but it's not the main point. It's an important point, but it's not the main focus of this story. The focus is about the fact that the bridegroom is coming. It's expected at the start, it happens in the middle, that's the main news, that's the main focus. And then at the end, it's reflected back, he's arrived. And yes, there are some consequences to it, but the point of this story is the bridegroom is coming. Jesus is the bridegroom. He is making it abundantly clear that he is coming. He might not be awake, either literally or figuratively, when he arrives, but he is coming, and therefore it is worth being prepared. He wants his disciples to be prepared. The question then is, well, what does being prepared look like? Does it mean having your bag packed? Does it mean spending 23 hours a day in prayer and worship? Well, thankfully Jesus carries on from this parable and he gives us more teaching to outline what being prepared looks like. We see in the parable of the talents about putting into action what's been given to us. We see in the teaching with the sheep and the goats around the consequences and the benchmark. There is unquestionably a call to action from Jesus. He's got expectations of those who claim to love him. He's got expectations about our lifestyle, our conduct, how we put love into action, how we respond to what he has called us to. But I think one of the interesting things that you see in this passage is focused very much around this idea of putting love into action, serving others, and responding to the call of Jesus in that way. One of the interesting things is actually the bar that Jesus sets is not that high. If you're just setting out, if you're just a new Christian or you're a Christian who's struggled with this, the bar for getting started is not that high. Getting hold of the olive oil is not that hard. When you look at the parable of the talents, actually the servant who doesn't do what he was supposed to, the master chastises him and says, you could have at least put it on deposit and got some interest, this money that I gave you. How hard's that? Just put it in the bank and get a bit of interest on it. That's not very hard. When you look at the teaching on the sheep and the goats, those who are judged to have done a good job kind of seem a little bit confused or puzzled by it. They're saying, well, when did we do all this good stuff that you're attributing to us? We didn't really do anything, did we? And Jesus says, whenever you did this, whenever. Not even you did it every day or all the time or 4 hours a day, or just whenever you did this least little thing in your eyes, this small getting started, whenever you did it for me. It's not that hard to get started with this, but it does take some kind of preparation. And there is an expectation, therefore, that we do it. Because the church is not meant to be idle. We are not meant to be, as Christians, sat back, ignoring suffering, ignoring injustice. We're called to serve the poor, the hungry, the marginalised, the vulnerable. You can't read Matthew chapter 25 and conclude otherwise. I don't believe you can read the Bible and miss it. We cannot, we shall not be a church of the indifferent, those who don't really care or don't really show that we care. And it's important to note that this parable applies to the church. It applies to us as individuals, but 10 young women, we said they represent the church. Well, this applies to the whole church. It's not just about doing our own bit, it's as a group. How do we put this into action as a church? And I think it's interesting. I think actually the 5 foolish virgins, I think there's a symmetry or a parallel or some kind of connection between their situation and the situation with the church in Laodicea, as talked about in the book of Revelation. Infamously referred to as lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, therefore distasteful. The church in Laodicea seems to have lost its passion, its drive, its commitment, its push for putting into action what Jesus has called them to. And yet even with that church, Jesus says, "See, I stand at the door and knock. If anybody would enter the door, I will enter in and eat with him and he with me." It's that easy. Jesus knocks on the door, all we have to do is open it. The bar is consistently low for getting started. It doesn't mean that we might not be called to more and greater things beyond that, but just getting started is pretty easy. In our own lives, what might that look like? Well, maybe it's about making sure you have some food on you, or being willing to buy a drink for somebody if they're begging on the street, and not just kind of walking by with you feeling slightly uncomfortable. Maybe it's about giving some time to spend with a person who you know who is lonely or needs some time. Maybe it wouldn't be somebody you'd normally expect to spend time with or particularly choose to for whatever reason, but actually you know that they'd really benefit from it. You know that they'd really value and appreciate it. Maybe it's about giving some time over to help at food bank, help at a collection, or help on one of the regular teams. Perhaps it's about how you decide where to spend your money. Not literally, well, not just do I spend money on this thing for myself or do I give it away to some good cause, but also even when I've got to spend money, I've got to buy food and clothes and stuff, but where do I buy from? What goods am I buying? Who made this t-shirt for £5? Really? Did they get paid a good wage for that? Were they treated well? This food that I'm buying, where was that grown? Were the workers treated with dignity and respect? Is that the best use of my money? Some of these things are incidental opportunities. You just get the opportunity to do the right thing and it just presents itself. It's there in front of you and you get to do it there and then. It's a spontaneous thing in the moment. But actually quite a bit of it is about needing to make some decisions in advance, making some choices. How am I best going to use my resources, my efforts, my energy, my time, my money? How, with those things that I have, am I, and is this church, going to put the message of Jesus, the love of Jesus, into action? These things are not out of reach for us. The bar is pretty low for getting started. And many of us, hopefully all of us, are already putting this into action in some ways anyway, but it doesn't do to stop thinking about it, stop planning, stop considering it. I'll be honest with you, there's a challenge to hearing a message like this. You can conclude actually that the message of the church is to do more, work harder, run faster, earn your way to heaven, impress Jesus by how much stuff you do. Think I've got to sign up for another 5 rotas. I've got to give more money away. I've got to do more. And to then associate that with, that's how I earn approval. That's how I get approval from Jesus, is by doing more and feeling either justified by the amount you do and thinking, yeah, I'm really good. I spend X number of hours a week, or give this much money, or do this so often. Or to feel really guilty. I never do enough. I could do more. I don't really need sleep. But it's not about earning our way to heaven. It's not about paying our dues. It's not about trying to impress Jesus. When we look at this parable, we see the 10 virgins. They are all invited before any of them have done anything with their lamps and their oil. They are all invited from the very start. This is a story about those who have been invited and whether they respond appropriately. The invitation was there before they did anything. They didn't earn it. We are saved by the grace of God through faith. It is a gift of God so that nobody can boast. It's not by works. That is not how we make our way to heaven. But the kind of flip side of that coin is faith, which is the gift of God. If it's real, if it's alive, if it's active in our lives, it will have some kind of consequence on our actions. It will stir us to putting love into action in the everyday things, maybe in the small things, maybe in the big things, but it will stir us to be doing something. And that is what being prepared for the return of Jesus looks like. And the wisdom in this is actually around how we go about the planning. I said it's important. Some of this stuff, you don't manage to do it if you don't plan, but equally, you need to be honest in your appraisal. Am I doing stuff? Do I need to do more? Or actually, am I doing what I need to do? And having some wisdom in recognising it's okay. I don't have to try and do an extra however many things. Because you can hear a talk like this and be stirred and think, yeah, I'm going to do more. Or you can feel condemned and think, I don't do enough. Sometimes when you feel condemned and say, I don't do enough, that's right. You don't do enough. Oftentimes, it's actually just the enemy trying to make you feel bad. That's where wisdom and planning and discernment come into this. How can I best use what I've been given to put love into action? It's not always easy. But actually we're called to do it together as a church, not as a group of however many individuals. And so there's actually a strengthening one another in this and helping to discern for one another. Actually, is this the right thing for us to be putting our efforts into now and in the long term? And actually that's one of the exciting things about the vision setting process that we're going through at the moment is thinking ahead. We can't do everything now, but what are we going to do in the future? Where do we want to go? How can we do the stuff that Jesus calls to us to as a church? Because it's abundantly clear there's an expectation from Jesus that we will have engaged our brains with this at least a little bit. We would have made the simplest of preparations. That's what the 5 wise virgins had done. Simple preparation, really. Common sense. The 5 foolish ones don't really seem to have bought into this invitation that they've received. The band are going to come back up in a moment and we'll kind of finish this morning's meeting with some worship. But I'd just like to pray. I'd like to pray for kind of 2 groups of people. I think there's people this morning who are feeling weighed down and guilty and I don't do enough. I probably need to do more. And actually it's not true. You need the freedom of knowing Jesus has done everything that you need to make your way to heaven, and that actually just having his Holy Spirit at work in your life will lead you naturally to do the things you need to do. What you're doing already is fine. You're doing well. You need to hear that message of good and faithful servant. You're doing well. But some of you maybe do need to hear the message of engage brain and think about what am I doing? Or engage with anything, do I need to do things differently? Not that you're not doing the right thing right now, or a good thing right now, but am I doing the best thing? Am I doing what God is still calling me to?